Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Ground News. There will be spoilers. Over 20 years ago, Clerks director Kevin Smith released An Evening with Kevin Smith, which featured the Silent Bob actor answering Q&A questions at colleges throughout the US. One of the best stories he had to tell was about working on the never-made Nick Cage Superman movie, where the notoriously strange producer John Peters insisted to Smith that the movie needed a climax that involves Superman battling a giant spider. It's a great story, and the kind you are bound to stumble on if you, like me, were reading about superheroes a lot online in the 2000s. In DC's The Flash, a movie that cost well over $200 million, this anecdote is brought to the big screen. It's maybe the most inside baseball moment in a movie that already feels like it would be completely incoherent to anyone who wasn't deeply familiar with the last 10 years of DC movies and Tim Burton's Batman. Now, there are probably many reasons why The Flash is doing so poorly at the box office. From the very public, very bad behavior of its star, to the fact that general interest in superhero movies seems to be down in general, aside from a couple notable exceptions. But one thing I want to hone in on this week is a worrying trend that I see in movies like this. How they increasingly feel like a snake eating their own tail, and how things like revisiting Man of Steel and Batman '89 ultimately only serve to distract from the elements of the movie that were actually clicking. I know there's some big fans of this film out there, and to an extent I do understand why. There are moments here that work, where it feels like you can spot the better version of a Flash solo movie that's buried under the mountain of bad CGI and fan pandering that we got. And that's too bad, because I think that's a version of this movie that I would have liked to have seen. Before I go any farther though, I guess I will mention that the movie was facing kind of an uphill battle for me from the start, as the Ezra Miller performance in Justice League is one of the worst aspects of either cut of that movie. It just feels heavily mannered and obnoxious in a way that does not work for me. And that continues here, especially near the start of the movie, where it really felt like the character was going to be just as bad. I honestly thought the first 20 minutes or so of this film was brutal, featuring some of the worst looking CGI I've seen in a major release in a pretty long while. Not to mention just plenty of lame jokes. Like Batman's lasso of truth moment where he says he would have done more good if he had given all of his money away. In a vacuum, this is fine, but it's also super hacky because it's a sentiment that you see go viral online at least once a month. To the point where it just feels like the lazy recycling of a tweet that I've already seen lazily recycled many times. This also marks the second DC movie I've seen this year where Wonder Woman shows up in a single scene to save the day and have the overly talkative lead of the film stammer and be hilariously awkward around her. And it was even less consequential or funny here than it was in Shazam! Fury of the Gods. I will say, I did like Bruce and Barry's unmasked scene though. I've always thought Affleck's Bruce was great, especially in the Snyder Cut, and I was happy to get a bit more of him here, even if I'll always be a little sad that he never got a solo movie to call his own. Let's move on to the real meat of the story though, time travel. So I'm probably far from the first person to say this, but when making a list of things I would have liked to have seen in this movie, a second, even more annoying Barry Allen would not have been on that list. Especially in the early going, I thought younger Barry was just unbearable. Now, to be fair, I thought they actually ended up handling this okay, where it really feels like the teen Barry changes and matures throughout the events of the film. But Miller's performance in those early scenes was just so grating and annoying. Now, I understand that this is purposeful, but that doesn't make it any more pleasant to sit through. But of course, I can't talk about this film for too long without really discussing a central part of its marketing: Supergirl and the return of Michael Keaton's Batman. And look, at the risk of coming off as overly dramatic here, I thought this was a complete misfire. Easily one of the worst elements of the movie. I love Michael Keaton as an actor, and I like his take on Batman as much as the next guy. But he was so poorly used. You could have swapped out this Batman with nearly any other version, and aside from some incredibly on-the-nose line callbacks, nothing would have changed. When he was first announced for the project, I had two major questions. How will his age be handled, and how closely will they hew to the unique visual language of the Burton films? I think they really failed on both counts. We get a line or two about Keaton being older, and we briefly revisit the sets from the '89 movie, but aside from that, it's just kind of a non-factor. When we meet Keaton, he's living like a hermit in a lonely Wayne Manor. We only get the vaguest sense of what drove him to this place, why he stopped being Batman, why he appears to have cut himself off from the world entirely, and the movie barely bothers with any of that stuff, for good reason, because it doesn't care. It takes very little convincing for him to shave off-screen and slip back into the Batsuit, not missing a single step as Batman. Actually, scratch that. More than not missing a step, if anything, he's better than ever. At over 70 years old, Keaton Batman is doing superheroic feats on a level that we've never seen before. Now, I understand that the '89 suit was really limiting in a way that you don't have to deal with when shooting a movie these days. But give me Burton's inventively shot action to hide that limitation over what we got here any day. With Keaton's bats jumping and flying around like a rubber ball. Never for a second feeling convincing. Not only do I think it looks bad, it dispenses with any real connection to where this character is at. The movie seems to view Keaton's age as something that it just needs to quickly acknowledge and move past, when I think the opposite is true. We've had plenty of great old Batman stories. I think there's even a case to be made that he's a character who could become more interesting with age, as he refuses to let go of the tragedy that drives him. Takes more risks as he can no longer count on his body in the same way that he did in his prime, and pushes himself into dangerous situations that are far less under his control. To me, that's interesting. That has some texture and some emotional stakes. But here, it's like they made him a lonely hermit with a sad, empty life, but didn't feel like exploring that at all. Even his dead parents' conversation with Barry Allen feels like it could have been done with any Batman, and it has nothing to say about this specific Bruce's circumstances. I was really bummed by this, honestly, and I will continue to mourn the Batman Beyond movie that we could have had. Supergirl is treated even worse. After a really intriguing introduction, she gets stuck in a loop of getting killed by Zod over and over again, and that's basically it. Her and Zod, and even Keaton's Batman, end up feeling far more like plot devices ready to be dropped at a moment's notice than actual characters. And then there's those cameos, which I found more disturbing and depressing than anything else. Many people have already talked about how unsettling it was to see a digitally resurrected Christopher Reeve, flying around from deep within the uncanny valley. But personally, I thought the George Reeves stuff was in even worse taste. Unlike Christopher Reeve, George Reeves blamed the role of Superman for putting him into a box his career could never escape from. He felt trapped by the character for the rest of his life, before tragically dying young at the age of 45. To insert him in here as some kind of winking cameo, alongside a goofy reference to a Kevin Smith anecdote, just felt gross to me. The kind of thing that instantly wiped out any remaining goodwill I had for this movie. I'm not saying everyone needs to feel this way. If you enjoyed these cameos, sure, I'm happy for you. But for me, it just played as deeply ghoulish. Now, the scenes with the Flash and his mom were, in contrast, a brighter spot of the movie. And it's definitely the one element of the film that feels like it has some heart underneath the grinding franchise machinery that is this story. I think that final scene in the grocery store was touching, and pretty well acted on both sides. So I don't want to be too grumpy about it, but I still do think this could have been so much more. Instead of wasting a ton of the film's running time on Supergirl and Zod, and stuff that barely ended up mattering at all, we could have spent more time with these characters. Remember that scene at the table in Spider-Man 2 where Peter finally confesses to Aunt May that he was there the night Uncle Ben died? It's a quiet scene of intense emotion, given plenty of room to breathe, in a relationship that still feels central to the movie even among the superhero action stuff. An overstuffed movie like The Flash doesn't really have time for scenes like that. Scenes that make supporting characters like May or Flash's mom feel more than one-dimensional. And I think that grocery store scene would have hit a lot harder if the Flash had come to understand something new about his parents, if he realized there was more to this person than just his childhood idea of her. The actress absolutely makes the most of the precious little screen time she has, but there's barely a character to be found. Definitely not a fleshed out one, at least. But even as the movie is brought to a close, and Flash's dad is magically saved at the 11th hour, the movie can't stop indulging in cameos, with George Clooney appearing as a new old Bruce Wayne. Meaning that I guess Barry is in a completely new reality than the one he started in. I don't think the movie really wants you to linger on that though, because hey look, it's movie star George Clooney. I'm not sure if this is supposed to be a signal that he's returning to the role of Batman in the upcoming Brave and the Bold. I guess that would be kind of interesting, sort of. But honestly, in this context, it's pretty hard to bring myself to care. There's something fitting about the fact that this movie ends with yet another old Batman movie reference. Because that inside baseball winking dominated the film, snuffing out any chance it had of feeling like an actual Flash solo movie. What we're left with is a film that endlessly panders to the nostalgia of fans like myself, but fails to do much of anything interesting on its own terms. Maybe I would have felt kinder towards this if the cameos hadn't put such a bad taste in my mouth. But as it stands now, I will be very happy to have this era of DC movies in the rearview mirror. So, I talk a lot about streaming services on this channel, usually from a very US-centric perspective, since that's obviously where I am. But lately, I've been receiving more and more comments that make me think I should try to broaden things out a bit and get a more global perspective. Now, a service that's already way ahead of me there is Ground News. This is an app that gives you a vast array of international news stories, offering insights from renowned sources across continents and cultures. There's obviously been a lot going on in Russia recently, and being able to get a far more in-depth global view where you can easily compare how these stories are being covered and where they're being covered has been really fascinating. Not to mention a real breath of fresh air from just depending on social media algorithms for my information. And Ground News doesn't just stop there, they track accuracy and bias as well, with each source evaluated for reliability, transparency, and adherence to journalistic standards. Plus, it allows you to follow different topics, from the economy to more specific things like entertainment news about Warner Brothers. It's truly the best way to get a global perspective on the news. So compare news coverage from diverse sources around the world on a transparent platform driven by data. Try Ground News today at ground.news/captainmidnight, or click on that link in the description below.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.